We've all heard of the Chernobyl disaster, but do we know the names of survivors and first responders? From the chilling first-hand accounts of survivors to the heroic acts of firefighters, these are the dark stories of Chernobyl survivors you've never heard. In the days following the Chernobyl disaster, dozens of lives were lost. But just 10 days later, there was a new threat in the form of potential nuclear steam explosions. There was now a concern about corium, a radioactive lava-like substance mixing with the water in the bubbler pools below. If that happened, it could cause a steam explosion, releasing even more radiation into the area. These explosions could have sent radioactive steam as far as Minsk, about 200 miles away. So to prevent this, the decision was made to drain the pools by opening the sluice gates. The problem was that these gates were controlled by valves located in a flooded underground annex next to Reactor 4. The path to the valves had been cleared, but the water was still knee-deep in some areas, thanks to firefighters who had used specialized hoses to make it passable. 3 men volunteered for the task: Aleksandr Akimov, Vasily Ignatenko, and Boris Boranov. Nobody thought they were going to survive, including these 3 who figured that they would die from radiation exposure, but they went ahead anyway, ready and willing to give up their lives in order to save hundreds of thousands of others. And miraculously, they succeeded, preventing an even worse disaster. Aleksandr Akimov is still alive, now living in Kiev, as well as Vasily Ignatenko. Unfortunately, Boris Boranov is no longer with us, but he survived 20 years after the mission, passing away in 2005 at the age of 64. All 3 have since been awarded the title Hero of Ukraine. This is Vasily Ignatenko. He was a Soviet firefighter, one of the first on the scene after the Chernobyl explosion in 1986. On that night, he and his team were called in to put out fires at the power plant, which had been caused by the debris from the exploded reactor. Ignatenko and his crew climbed up to the roof of the building, where they had to fight flames caused by radioactive material. They were dealing with fires, but at the same time, the radiation levels were severe. As they worked, they started feeling the effects of radiation sickness, nausea, weakness, and vomiting. The water system had been damaged in the blast, so they had to use hoses from a fire escape to put out the fires, but it wasn't enough to protect them from the radiation. Eventually, they couldn't keep going. Ignatenko and the others were helped down from the roof and rushed to the hospital. He was later transferred to Moscow, where doctors tried a bone marrow transplant, but it didn't work. His body just kept deteriorating. By May 13th, just a couple weeks after the disaster, Ignatenko passed away from the effects of radiation poisoning. It only makes sense to talk about Vasily's wife, Lyudmilla Ignatenko, as well. She stayed by his side until his death, knowing full well that she could be exposed to harmful radiation too. After the explosion, Lyudmilla traveled with Vasily's father to Moscow, where he was being treated for severe radiation poisoning. Even though his condition was rapidly worsening, she stayed at the hospital, caring for him as he deteriorated. Vasily's health declined quickly, and it was Lyudmilla who called their family to Moscow when he was near death. On the night of April 26, 1986, Aleksandr Yuvchenko was on a night shift at Chernobyl's reactor number 4, expecting a quiet shift after the reactor had been powered down for a safety test. But around 1:23 a.m., a massive explosion shook the plant. "The doors of my office were blown out," he said, describing this violent rush of dust and steam. In the chaos, debris fell around them as the lights went out. Alexander and a colleague ran to the transport corridor to find shelter, having no idea what had just happened. They thought maybe something heavy had fallen or even that war had broken out, but soon they realized that the reactor had exploded. After trying to call the control room with no luck, Alexander was ordered to bring stretchers. When he reached the control room, he met a colleague who was so severely burned he was almost totally unrecognizable. The man told him to go to the explosion site where others were injured, and it was completely horrific. The water coolant system was destroyed, pipes were hanging, and the reactor hull had been reduced to rubble. Alexander even said he saw a blue light rising from the reactor, a sign of deadly radiation. Knowing he could die from the radiation, he and others still tried to help. He saw workers sent to manually lower the control rods into the reactor, but they never made it back. He was left alone, barely surviving, with radiation sickness setting in. By 5 a.m., he was too weak to walk, and he was rushed to the hospital. Radiation left him with burns constant transfusions and long-term health problems, but miraculously, he did manage to survive. The Chernobyl liquidators were thousands of workers, including soldiers, firefighters, and engineers who were sent to contain the disaster. They worked under extreme conditions, cleaning up radioactive debris, building a concrete sarcophagus to encase the reactor, and helped in fighting fires. Unfortunately, a lot of them suffered from severe radiation sickness, cancers, and other long-term health issues, and those were just the ones who survived long enough. Unfortunately, their sacrifices were mostly ignored until much later, too. So, I'm going to show you a handful of surviving Chernobyl liquidators, along with quotes from them reflecting on the work they did in the aftermath of the disaster. This is Kozhevshna Ivanivna. I grew up in an orphanage. My fate was my own. If you are working somewhere, then you are responsible for that place of work. This is Yashin Mikhailovich, who said, "Nobody was obliged to work. I did my job. I wasn't forced to. After the accident, Pripyat was completely cut off from the country. You couldn't send a telegram or call anyone." Pictured here is Shirokov Alexei Vichlovich. "No, I never regretted a thing. Nobody forced us to be there. I was invited to work, and the young lads, I tried to protect them. After a stroke, I can hardly remember my words." Viktor Bryukhanov was the manager in charge of constructing the Chernobyl nuclear power plant and served as its director until 1986. On the night of the disaster, he was called about an incident at the plant, but he didn't know that there was a test happening at the time. As he passed by reactor 4, he saw the damage and immediately ordered all authorities to meet at the nuclear bunker. Bryukhanov tried reaching the shift supervisor, but there was no response, so he activated the general radiation accident alarm, notifying the Ministry of Energy. Despite the obvious damage, Bryukhanov and his team were still trying to manage the situation, unaware that the reactor was already destroyed. Later, when Bryukhanov went to the courtyard and saw graphite pieces on the ground, he still couldn't believe that the reactor was gone. "This did not fit in my head," he said. In the aftermath, he was questioned about the incident, stating, "I am guilty. As a leader, I did not finish something. Somewhere I showed negligence, indiscretion." He was found guilty of gross safety violations and sentenced to 10 years in prison. He took some accountability, but also did insist that the accident was caused by flawed technology, not just human error. Anatoly Dyatlov was the deputy chief engineer at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant and oversaw the operations of reactor 4. On the night of the disaster, Dyatlov was supervising the test that went horribly wrong. Before the test, he ordered the reactor power to be reduced to 200 megawatts, but when the reactor stalled, they couldn't raise it without risking a dangerous situation. But Dyatlov allowed the power to be increased, not fully understanding the risks. Unfortunately, this power increase led to the reactor's explosion, and even after the explosion, Dyatlov was in denial about how severe this really was. He continued ordering actions to restore control, like trying to manually insert control rods, but by then, it was just too late. When radiation sickness set in, he tried to report to his superiors, all while showing symptoms like vomiting from radiation exposure. He spent time in the hospital and suffered hair loss and burns from radiation, but he did survive. He was later blamed for the disaster in court, but he insisted that the reactor's design flaws, not operation error, were to blame. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. He later wrote about the flaws in the reactor design, claiming that the accident was, quote, caused by completely inappropriate characteristics of the reactor. He died in 1995 from bone marrow cancer, most likely caused by radiation exposure. Aleksandr Akimov was the shift supervisor at Chernobyl's reactor 4 during the disaster. Again, when the reactor stalled and they tried to raise power again, it put the reactor in a dangerous state. Akimov ordered the emergency shutdown button to be pressed, but instead of stopping the reactor, it made the situation worse, causing the explosion. After the blast, Akimov and his team stayed in the reactor building trying to pump water into the core, and they continued working even when starting to show signs of radiation sickness. Akimov later said, "I believe what I was hearing about the reactor's damage. It just didn't seem possible." Akimov was exposed to a lethal dose of radiation and was sent to Moscow for treatment. But by the time investigators came to question him, he was too weak to speak. In the end, Akimov died from radiation sickness 2 weeks after the explosion, at just 33 years old. Evgeny Yashin was 40 years old when the Chernobyl disaster hit in April of 1986. He worked as a chemist at the plant, and on that fateful day, he was on a bus heading to work. Recalling the incident in an interview, he said, "Everyone was talking about the explosion of the reactor's emergency cooling system, but passing by the fourth power unit, it became clear to us that it was much more serious than expected. The wall of the reactor had completely fallen out, and a glow could be seen, resembling a steel foundry oven. We took action immediately." End quote. Yashin was in charge of a 300-person team at Chernobyl's chemical workshop, where their main job was to prepare demineralized water and process radioactive waste. "We prepared the water to extinguish the reactor, walked knee-deep in water, and organized pumping. Water appeared to be flowing endlessly. The system was launched at full capacity, and more water was required," he said. On April 27th, Pripyat was evacuated, and Yashin remembers the buses going through the city to pick up residents and staff en route. By early May, staff began suffering serious side effects. Doctors were regularly monitoring their health, and some were even taken out of the zone to rest. Years later, Yashin still feels the effects on his health. For one, he has cancer, and he's gone on to say, "Very few of my colleagues are still alive. I am surprised that I, myself, am still alive." Another man I think is worth mentioning is Igor Kostin. Igor Kostin was one of only 5 photographers to capture images during the disaster. Working for the Novosti press agency in Kiev, he was sent to cover the immediate aftermath of the accident. You may have never heard his name, but you've probably seen his photos. Kostin's aerial images of the plant have become pretty iconic, and at the time, he was showing the true scale of the destruction when the Soviet government was trying to downplay how bad it really was. But Kostin didn't just photograph the immediate aftermath, he also documented the long-term effects, including deformities in animals born in the contaminated area. He made repeated trips into the exclusion zone to document the destruction caused by nuclear radiation. And he passed away in 2015 at 78 years old. With all that said, I've been your host, James. I'll catch you, yes you specifically, in the next video. Sorry, Dalia.